I remember the trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a place where I could escape from the noise of the city and just breathe. The plan was simple: get away for a weekend, be alone, enjoy nature. Nothing fancy, no big plans. Just me, a small backpack, some food, and the cabin deep in the woods that I had rented online. The pictures looked perfect. A small wooden cabin with a porch overlooking a dense forest, far from anything, no neighbors in sight. Promised peace and quiet, exactly what I wanted. The drive out there was long but calm. As I left the city behind, the roads became narrower, lined with tall pine trees that reached up to the sky. The air smelled fresher the closer I got, the sunlight filtering softly through the branches. I parked the car at the end of a gravel path, then walked the last few hundred meters down a narrow trail that led directly to the cabin. It felt isolated, like it was hidden away from the rest of the world. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. Weathered wood walls, a slanted roof, and windows with thick glass. It had electricity but no cell signal. I wasn't sure about internet. That didn't bother me. I wanted to disconnect, and here I could. I unpacked my things slowly, setting down my bags, arranging the small kitchen area, checking the little wood stove inside. The cabin smelled of old wood, dry pine needles from the outside, and a faint mustiness that comes from being closed up for a while. Outside, the forest was alive. Birds called occasionally, small animals rustled in the underbrush, and the wind whispered through the trees. I set up a small campfire pit just off the porch, gathering dry twigs and logs from the forest floor. I knew the nights would be cold. As the sun started to drop behind the trees, I built the fire carefully, making sure it caught and began to burn steadily. The first night passed without much incident, but I didn't sleep well. The cabin creaked sometimes as the wind moved the trees around it, and every little noise seemed louder than it really was in the dark. I told myself it was normal, just the house settling and the forest making its own sounds. But there was something about being alone in a place so remote that made everything feel more intense, like I was more aware than I ever was at home. The second day I spent hiking nearby, exploring the trails that wound through the trees. The woods were thick, green, and peaceful during the day. I felt calm walking among the trees, the sun dappling through the leaves, the soft dirt beneath my boots. I even found a small stream where I filled my water bottle. I kept my phone in my pocket, but there was no signal, just the quiet hum of the forest. When I returned to the cabin that evening, the sun was already low. The sky was turning orange and pink. I noticed something strange right away. The fire pit where I had left some leftover ashes and half-burned logs was cold. That wasn't unusual, but nearby, the ground looked disturbed. The dirt and leaves were pushed aside in a rough circle, like someone had dug there recently or maybe shifted the soil. I told myself maybe an animal had been digging, maybe a raccoon or something, nothing to worry about. Still, it made me uneasy. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The cabin felt tighter somehow, like the walls were closing in. I had brought a small knife with me, more for cutting food than anything else, but I kept it close just in case. I tried to relax, lighting the stove and heating some canned soup. Outside, the wind was stronger now, rustling branches and leaves. The night was darker, cloudier. No moonlight made it through. Then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, just tiny sounds, soft snaps of twigs, rustling near the edges of the clearing. I told myself it was just animals, but the sounds didn't stop. They circled the cabin, moving closer and then farther away. It was like someone was walking just out of sight in the trees, always staying on the edge. I stared out the windows, eyes straining to see through the darkness, but there was nothing there, only shadows. I stayed inside and tried to ignore it, but every few minutes, there was a fresh sound, something scraping against the wood walls, a soft knock on the porch, a faint brushing against the side of the cabin. I never heard voices or footsteps on the porch itself, but the noises were close enough to make my heart race. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay on the bed with the knife on the bedside table, every nerve on edge. The sounds never stopped. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted, but relieved to see the pale light filtering in. I decided I'd had enough and would pack up in the morning. But morning didn't bring peace. As I stepped outside, the disturbed ground around the fire pit looked worse. It was a small circle, maybe 2 or 3 feet across, where the dirt was freshly dug and scattered. Nearby, I found something that made my stomach turn. A thin, twisted piece of wire tangled in the bushes. It looked like part of a trap or some kind of crude snare. My mind jumped to worst-case scenarios. Someone was out here watching, maybe setting traps around the cabin. I searched the perimeter of the clearing, looking for any more signs. There were faint footprints in the soft earth, but I couldn't tell if they were fresh or old. The path I had walked down to the car looked normal, but the woods around the cabin felt wrong now, like I was being watched by unseen eyes. I didn't want to believe it, but the reality was clear. Someone had been here recently. Someone had been close enough to touch the cabin, to dig in the ground, to leave traps or wires around. This was no random animal. This was a person. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag. I kept the knife in my hand, feeling safer with it than without. Before I left, I walked one last time around the cabin, checking windows, doors, the porch. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the porch itself. Whoever it was, they were careful. I took the trail back to the car as fast as I could, the forest suddenly feeling hostile. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every crack of a branch made my heart race. The car was exactly where I had left it. I jumped in and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I saw a figure standing just inside the treeline, watching me. I couldn't tell much about the person, just a shadow in the trees, tall and still. They didn't move as I pulled away, driving fast down the gravel path, not looking back until I was on the paved road and far away. Since that day, I haven't gone back to the cabin. The pictures online still show the peaceful place it was supposed to be, but I know better. There was no ghost, no magic, no fairy tale. Just someone out there, alone in the woods, watching, waiting. And that is the scariest thing of all. The idea that someone unknown can be so close, so silent, so real. That kind of fear doesn't come from stories or legends. It comes from the knowledge that sometimes the real danger isn't far away. Sometimes it's just beyond the window, watching you in the dark. I never planned on spending a night in that cabin. In fact, I didn't even want to be out in those woods at all. But life has a way of pushing you where you least want to go. It started as a last-minute decision to get away from the city, away from the noise, the crowded streets, and the constant buzz of people. I wanted silence, some peace, and a place where I could just think. The cabin was supposed to be perfect for that. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and nobody would bother me there. What I didn't realize then was how quickly peace can turn into something else entirely. I had found the cabin online, on a little rental site that promised a rustic, off-the-grid experience. The pictures showed a small wooden house, surrounded by trees that looked old and thick, with a river running nearby. No internet, no cell signal, and no electricity beyond a single generator. It sounded perfect. I booked it for a weekend, planning to hike, read, and just clear my head. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday. The drive was long, winding through rough country roads with nothing but forest on either side. As I got closer, the air changed, became cooler and heavier, the scent of pine thick. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees. I was excited at first, pulling my bag out of the car and locking the doors behind me. The cabin sat on a small clearing, the wood worn and gray from years of weather, but solid. A thin trail ran down from the porch into the woods. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint muskiness. It was small, with just one main room, a kitchen area, and a tiny bathroom. There was a wood stove for heat, some old furniture covered in dust sheets, and a stack of firewood by the door. A large window looked out over the forest, letting in the last of the fading light. I put my things down and took a moment to look around. Everything was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls settling and the sound of birds chirping in the distance. After unpacking, I built a small fire in the stove, careful to light it properly. The warmth spread quickly, making the room feel cozy. I had brought a book with me, but I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the forest grow dark. The trees moved slightly in the evening breeze, their branches tapping softly against each other. It was peaceful, but something about the silence was also unsettling. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of waiting. I decided to take a walk before night fell completely. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was alive with sounds. Crickets, distant calls of birds, and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The trail was narrow and uneven, twisting between thick tree trunks and under low-hanging branches. I moved carefully, feeling the weight of the dark settling around me. The farther I walked, the more isolated I felt. No cars, no signs of other people, just me and the woods. I kept telling myself this was what I wanted. This quiet, this escape. But my heart was beating faster than I expected. At one point, I stopped and listened hard. There was a faint snapping of twigs nearby, but when I shone the flashlight in that direction, nothing moved. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself I was alone but safe. When I got back to the cabin, it was fully dark. The only light was from the fire in the stove and my small battery lantern. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and settled in. I made a simple dinner on the little propane stove, a can of soup and some bread. The food tasted bland, but it was enough. I cleaned up quietly, my ears tuned to every sound outside. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned and creaked like old bones. Somewhere far off, an animal called out, a sharp, long cry that made me jump. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to strange noises, the rustling of leaves, a soft tapping on the cabin walls, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the underbrush just outside. Each time I'd lie still, heart racing, straining to hear more. The dark outside seemed endless and thick, pressing against the windows like it was alive. I kept telling myself I was alone, but every sound felt too close. I didn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't the only thing moving in those woods. In the morning, the light felt weak and cold. I wrapped myself in a thick sweater and went outside to get some fresh air. The sun was low, barely breaking through the dense canopy. The forest looked less friendly in the light, the trees standing tall and silent like watchers. I started a fire outside to boil some water for coffee. The smoke rose slowly, curling into the gray sky. I spent the day exploring the immediate area. The river was just a few hundred feet from the cabin, a narrow stream running over smooth stones. The water was icy cold, and I ran my hands through it, feeling the shock of the chill. There were animal tracks around, deer, squirrels, maybe even a bear. I found a fallen tree I could sit on and watched the birds flit through the branches. The forest was full of life, but also full of danger if you weren't careful. I tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, made me pause. I kept imagining someone out there, hidden, waiting. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation messing with my head. Still, I couldn't shake it. As the day wore on, the clouds gathered and the wind grew stronger. I hurried back to the cabin, stacking more wood by the stove. I locked the doors and windows and settled in early. The fire roared, filling the room with heat and light. I told myself I'd sleep better this night, but I didn't. In the middle of the night, I woke again. This time the sounds were different. Not the wind or the animals, but something deliberate. Quiet footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful, and not random at all. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the footsteps moved around the cabin. There was a long pause, then the sound of something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor of the porch. My mind raced through every possible explanation. I wanted to call for help, but there was no signal. My phone was useless here. The generator powered some lights, but only when I turned it on, and I was too afraid to get up. The cabin was small and the walls were thin. Whoever was out there could hear me breathing. The footsteps stopped at the back door. I could hear someone fiddling with the latch, the sound slow and methodical, My breath caught in my throat. The door didn't open. After a moment, the footsteps moved away, dragging sounds continuing for a short distance before fading. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to move, too scared to sleep. When morning came, I forced myself to get up. I opened the front door carefully. The porch was covered in wet leaves and small scratches, like someone had been scraping at the wood. There were footprints in the dirt, clear and fresh, leading into the woods. They were too big to be mine, and they looked heavy, like a man's boots. I didn't know what to do. I packed some food and water and decided to hike out to the nearest road, about 3 miles away. The woods were dense and rough, but I kept to the trail, always looking behind me. The feeling of being followed didn't leave. On the way, I found signs that someone had been camping or staying in the woods nearby. An old tent frame, a small fire pit with cold ashes, and some scattered cans. Whoever had been here before me had left quickly. I walked for hours. The trail twisted and climbed through hills and over fallen logs. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I kept moving. As I neared the road, I saw a small pickup truck parked by the side, with no driver in sight. That's when I heard voices, not far away. Men's voices, talking quietly but with urgency. I stayed hidden behind a tree, heart racing. They were too close for comfort. I didn't want to be found. I waited until they left. When the road was clear, I ran to the truck and found the keys in the ignition. The doors were unlocked. I got in, locked it, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back into the woods one last time. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told anyone exactly what happened there. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is quiet, I can still hear the sound of footsteps on the porch and the scraping at the door. The first time I saw the cabin, it was already dusk. The sky was a dull, gray-blue, heavy with clouds that promised rain by nightfall. I had been driving for hours, wanting to get away from the noise of the city, away from people, from the buzz of work emails, and the constant glare of screens. The cabin was supposed to be a simple place to rest and think. A small, rented structure deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. When I pulled up, the gravel driveway was uneven and lined by tall pines that seemed to lean in close, casting long, dark shadows. The cabin itself was old, built from rough logs darkened by years of weather. Its windows were dusty and the porch creaked beneath my feet as I stepped out. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something faintly metallic, like old rust. I was alone, and for a moment that felt good. Inside, the cabin was cramped but sturdy. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table scarred by years of use, and a worn-out sofa covered in blankets. The windows looked out over a dense forest, the trees swaying quietly in the wind. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the place feel like mine, even if just for a few days. That first night, I slept badly. The walls creaked with the wind, and unfamiliar sounds filtered in through the cracks. The rustle of branches, the distant call of birds settling down for the night. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving outside, but when I looked, nothing was there. The dark felt thicker here, more pressing. It was a quiet, kind of lonely that pressed down on your chest, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The next day, I explored the woods around the cabin. The trees were tall, thick, and close, their trunks scarred by years of weather and time. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in layers of pine needles and dead leaves. Occasionally, I found signs of animals, tracks, feathers, broken twigs, but no animals themselves. The silence was overwhelming. It felt like the forest was waiting for something, like it was paused just before something important was about to happen. That afternoon, I noticed the cabin's power wasn't working. No surprise, there was no power line visible anywhere nearby. The stove was wood burning, so at least I could make a fire. I gathered some logs from a pile near the back and stacked them carefully next to the stove. The smell of burning wood was comforting and made the cabin feel less empty. As evening came on again, the sky darkened quickly. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the trees outside. I sat close to the stove, the fire flickering shadows on the walls, trying to read a book but finding it hard to focus. The silence of the forest made my thoughts loud, and soon I was hearing every tiny sound the cabin made. The groan of wood settling, the clatter of branches scraping the roof, the occasional thump that sounded too heavy to be a small animal. Around midnight, I woke suddenly to a noise outside the cabin. At first, it was a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over the ground. I held my breath, listening hard. The sound stopped. Then, a few moments later, a sharp snap, like a branch breaking, came from just beyond the porch. My heart hammered in my chest. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't feel right. I got up slowly and reached for the flashlight I had on the table. I didn't want to open the door, but I had to know what was out there. I cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The beam of the flashlight swept over the porch, the logs, the trees beyond. There was nothing. No animals, no people, no movement at all. Only the dark. I closed the door quickly and locked it. My hands were shaking as I sat back down, the fire suddenly too small and weak against the cold dark outside. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was nothing. I was alone out here, far from anyone else. But the feeling stayed, that something was watching. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the fear from the night before. I stepped outside and looked around the yard. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, with birds singing and sunlight filtering through the branches. Still, I noticed something odd near the edge of the trees. A set of footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. They were large, wider than a human foot, and ran from the edge of the forest straight toward the cabin, stopping just short of the porch. I crouched down and traced the prints with my fingers. They looked fresh, made during the night. My stomach twisted. I checked the area around the cabin carefully. No other signs, no broken branches or disturbed bushes, just those prints. I didn't know what kind of animal could leave prints like that. I had seen plenty of animal tracks before, deer, bears, coyotes, but nothing that matched these. They were too big for any normal animal, too round and oddly shaped. It was unsettling. I stayed close to the cabin the rest of the day. I didn't go far into the forest. Instead, I chopped more firewood, cleaned the kitchen, and tried to make the place feel more like a home. But every sound made me jump. The creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the wind itself. That night, I slept with the door locked and the flashlight on the table. At about 2 in the morning, I woke again to noises outside. This time, it was heavier, like footsteps moving slowly around the cabin, circling it in the dark. I could hear them step on twigs, crunch leaves, then stop, then start again. I didn't dare look outside. Instead, I grabbed the kitchen knife I had brought with me, the only weapon I had, and sat by the door listening. The footsteps stopped. A long silence followed. Then, something scraped against the side of the cabin. A harsh, grinding noise, like claws or rocks dragged across the wood. My breath caught in my throat. The cabin shook slightly as the scraping moved along the walls, then stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to sleep. When the first light came through the window, I finally allowed myself to look outside. There was nothing in sight. The forest looked calm again, peaceful and quiet. But on the porch, where the scraping had been, the wood was scratched deeply, gouged in several places. The marks were jagged, uneven, and fresh. I touched them, feeling the rough splinters under my fingertips. Whoever or whatever had done this was big and strong. The rest of the day, I stayed inside, barricading the door with a chair and keeping the fire going. I rationed my food carefully, knowing I might have to stay longer than planned. I tried to tell myself the noises and scratches were from animals or the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. That evening, I found something new. On the back of the cabin, near the woodpile, there was a long, dark smear on the logs, like someone had dragged a heavy object or had their hand pressed there, leaving a dirty stain. It was sticky and rough to the touch. My stomach turned. I realized then I was being watched and maybe even stalked. The prints, the noises, the scratches, the smear, they weren't random. They were signs, a warning. I thought about leaving right then, but I didn't have a car. The nearest road was miles away, and the forest was thick and confusing. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window with the knife in my hand, watching the dark forest. At one point, I saw a shadow move just beyond the trees. A tall, bulky shape, too big for any deer or bear I'd ever seen. It stood still for a moment, then vanished back into the woods. I spent the next day preparing to leave. I packed everything I could into my backpack and decided I would hike out in the morning. I marked my route carefully with scraps of cloth tied to branches so I wouldn't get lost. The forest felt more threatening than ever, every sound sharper, every rustle heavier. That night was the worst. The noises outside grew louder and closer. There were heavy footsteps all around the cabin, scraping, dragging, thumping. The wood walls shook with the force of whatever was outside. I felt trapped and helpless. The fire was dying low, the room growing cold and dark. At one point, the door shook violently, as if someone was trying to break it down. I held the knife tightly, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it would burst. The door stopped shaking. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. It stretched on for a long time, until finally, just before dawn, everything went quiet. When the sun rose, I wasted no time. I stepped outside, heart hammering, and started walking through the forest, following the markers I'd made. The forest was dense and difficult to navigate, but I kept moving. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. Every shadow made me quicken my pace. After several hours, I finally reached a dirt road. I was exhausted, dirty, and scared out of my mind, but I was safe. A passing car stopped to give me a ride to the nearest town, where I finally felt free. Looking back, I never saw whatever was outside that cabin again. But the scratches on the walls, the strange footprints, and the heavy footsteps in the night stayed with me. The cabin stood just at the edge of the forest, tucked away from the main road by nearly a mile of rough dirt track. It wasn't much. A small, weathered wooden shack with faded paint peeling off its walls and a sagging porch that creaked whenever the wind blew. I had found it listed online as a weekend rental, a place where I could escape the city noise, the crowds, and the never-ending deadlines of work. Promised solitude and quiet. I wanted that. More than anything, I wanted to get away from everything for a while. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was dipping low behind the tall pines. The light caught the tops of the trees and threw long shadows across the dusty ground. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, fresh and sharp in a way city air never was. It was the kind of smell that fills your lungs and makes you feel awake in a way nothing else can. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, maybe a little worse for wear, but that didn't matter. The inside was simple, just a single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove in the corner, and a bed pushed against the far wall. There was no electricity or running water, which I expected. I'd brought a few cans of food, a water jug, and a lantern. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember thinking it was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind that makes every little sound stand out. After I unpacked, I decided to take a walk around the cabin before it got dark. The forest around was dense, mostly pine and birch trees, the ground covered with dry needles and thick moss. As I moved through the trees, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed empty. No birds, no rustling animals, no insects buzzing. Nothing. It was strange because the forest I grew up near was always full of life. Here, it felt like all the living things had just stopped moving. I kept walking until the light was almost gone. Then I headed back. Inside, I started a fire in the stove, using some dry kindling I'd found stacked outside. The flames crackled and threw flickering shadows across the walls. The fire made the place feel a little less cold and a little less lonely. I sat down on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds outside. The wind began to pick up, rustling the branches and sending dry leaves skittering across the porch. That's when I first noticed it, a low, distant noise, like a slow knocking or tapping. It was faint, almost like it was coming from far away, but steady. Not a random sound carried by the wind, but something deliberate, rhythmic. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the old cabin settling or a branch tapping against the window. But the noise didn't stop. It went on for hours, steady and slow, like someone was knocking on wood far off in the woods. I lay down to sleep but couldn't stop thinking about the noise. It seemed too regular, too deliberate to be just a coincidence. I kept wondering who or what would be out there, knocking on something in the middle of the forest at night. The next morning, the forest looked different. The sun was higher, but there was still that strange quiet. No birds sang, no animals stirred. The knocking noise was gone, but now I felt a different kind of tension in the air, like something was watching. I walked down the path to the dirt road, hoping to see a car or a neighbor or any sign of life, but the road was empty. No tire tracks, no footprints, just bare dirt and pine needles. I went back to the cabin and decided to explore a bit more of the surrounding woods. I took my backpack and filled my water bottle. The forest was thick, with fallen logs covered in moss and little clearings where the sun lit up the ground. As I walked, I noticed the trees were scarred in places. Long, deep scratches running up the bark, as if something had clawed at them. I didn't think much of it until I saw the ground near the base of the trees. The soil was freshly disturbed, and there were patches of flattened grass and broken branches, like something heavy had been dragged through. The scratches and the disturbed ground led deeper into the forest, away from the cabin. I followed the trail for maybe half an hour until it opened into a small clearing. There, I saw something that made my heart stop. A makeshift structure built from branches and logs, covered with torn pieces of cloth and plastic. It looked like a rough shelter, maybe made by someone living out here. Near it, I spotted some scraps of paper and a few old cans scattered around. The place looked abandoned but recent. Something about the clearing felt wrong. The air was heavy and still. I turned back toward the cabin as fast as I could, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the day keeping an eye on the woods. I was almost certain I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. That night, the knocking came back, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just on one side of the cabin. It seemed to come from all around me. I grabbed my lantern and stepped outside, shining the light into the trees. The forest was dark and empty, but the knocking kept going, slow and steady. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I wanted to call for help, but there was no cell signal, no way to contact anyone. The cabin was completely cut off. I spent the night awake, listening to the knocking and trying to make sense of it. It was as if something was pacing around the cabin, tapping on trees, hitting logs. Couldn't sleep. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Large, uneven, and not like any animal I knew. The prints weren't regular, as if whoever or whatever left them had been moving slowly, hesitating. They led into the forest and back, circling the cabin in a wide loop. My unease grew, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some hunters or trappers had been nearby, maybe a lost hiker, but the lack of people and the strange noises didn't add up. On the third day, I noticed something else. The firewood I had stacked outside was disturbed. Logs were moved, some broken. It looked like someone had been there, rifling through my supplies. I checked the cabin carefully. Nothing was stolen, but it felt like a warning. That night, the knocking started earlier, around dusk. It was different now, more urgent, sometimes tapping on the porch steps, sometimes louder on the side walls. I felt trapped. I didn't want to go outside, but also didn't want to stay in and wait for something to break in. Then, just before midnight, something hit the window with a heavy thud. I jumped up and grabbed a kitchen knife I kept on the table. I pressed myself against the far wall, breathing hard, eyes on the window. The knocking stopped suddenly. The forest was silent again. I waited, tense, until the first light of dawn. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, I saw new signs. Deep claw marks on the porch railing, splinters where something had hit hard, and strange symbols scratched into the wood. They looked like random scratches, but the shapes were deliberate, forming patterns that chilled me. I spent the day packing, deciding I would leave as soon as possible. The forest no longer felt safe. Whatever had been here, watching, knocking, had made itself clear. I didn't want to find out what would happen if I stayed another night. On the way out, I took one last look back at the cabin. The trees around it seemed darker somehow, shadows gathering in the branches. The silence pressed in like a weight. I drove away down the dirt road, my heart still pounding. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, swallowed up by the forest's edge. That was the last time I went back to that place. I never told anyone about the knocking or the scratches or the strange shelter in the clearing. Some things don't need explaining, and some places aren't meant to be revisited. The cabin was a reminder that some parts of the world stay wild and watching, and that sometimes being alone out there isn't as safe as it seems. The air was cold and sharp when I first stepped out of my car onto the gravel driveway leading up to the cabin. It was late October, and the trees surrounding the area were in their last phase of shedding leaves. The ground was a patchwork of browns, yellows, and dull reds, damp from the early morning mist that still clung low over the forest floor. I could smell the wet earth mixed with the sharp scent of pine needles, and for a moment, the silence settled in around me like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of quiet that felt almost unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I had rented the cabin for a week, seeking some solitude away from the noise of the city and the constant pull of screens and deadlines. The listing had promised a rustic retreat, perfect for someone wanting to disconnect. I wasn't expecting luxury, just a simple wooden cabin nestled deep enough into the woods to feel like I was truly alone. That was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no internet, no distractions. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing. It was an old structure, made of rough-hewn logs that were weathered from years of wind and rain. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were small and covered in a film of dirt and grime. A thin wisp of smoke curled up from the chimney, which told me the previous renter must have just left or the caretaker had stopped by recently. There was a small wooden porch with a couple of creaky chairs and a stack of firewood neatly piled against the side wall. I grabbed my bags and stepped onto the porch, feeling the wood shift slightly under my weight. The door was old but solid, with a rusty iron latch. I unlocked it and pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a long creak that echoed inside the cabin. The air inside was stale and smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. Dust particles floated lazily in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows. The cabin was small, about 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen area. The main room had a stone fireplace at one end, with a stack of dry wood beside it, and a threadbare rug covering part of the creaking wooden floor. There was a rickety table with 2 chairs, and an old armchair that looked like it had seen better days. The second room was the bedroom with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out into the dense woods. I set my bags down and went to the kitchen area. It had a small stove, a sink, and a few cabinets. Everything looked functional but worn. I opened one of the cabinets and found a box of matches, some canned food, and a couple of bottles of water. Not much, but enough to get me started. I figured I would head into town the next day to get more supplies. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The crackle of the fire and the occasional pop of burning wood were the only sounds inside the cabin. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl punctuated the darkness. I lay on the bed, listening to the quiet, feeling the strange calm of being somewhere so far from everything. It was during the second night that things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 a.m., chilled despite the fire still burning low in the fireplace. The wind outside had picked up, howling softly through the cracks in the windows. As I lay there, I thought I heard something else. A faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the outside walls. I strained my ears, but it was gone, swallowed up by the wind. The next morning, I went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I noticed some odd marks near the porch steps. They looked like scratches but too large and deep to be from a small animal. Maybe a deer or a bear had been curious, I thought. The area was wild after all. Over the next few days, I settled into a quiet routine. I chopped firewood, fetched water from the nearby creek, and spent hours just sitting in the armchair, watching the forest. The isolation was peaceful but sometimes unnerving. The trees were thick, blocking most of the sky, and shadows moved in strange ways as the sun shifted. At night, I double-checked the locks and closed all the curtains, feeling a creeping unease whenever the wind picked up. One evening, around dusk, I noticed something strange while walking near the creek. There were fresh footprints in the mud, large and heavy. They looked like human boots, but I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. The footprints led from the woods to the creek and then vanished into the trees on the other side. I felt a chill slide down my spine. I took out my phone to call the rental office, but there was no signal. I wasn't surprised, but the feeling of being completely cut off suddenly became sharper. The following day, I found more evidence of someone else being nearby. A few feet from the cabin door, someone had left a small pile of rocks stacked in a crude tower. It wasn't there the day before. Whoever it was must have been watching, or maybe trying to send some kind of message. I told myself not to worry. Maybe a local hiker or hunter had passed through, or the caretaker had come by. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt colder somehow, as if the trees themselves were closing in. That night, I slept with the fireplace embers glowing and the cabin door bolted tight. But I was woken again by a noise, louder this time. A dragging sound, slow and heavy, coming from outside the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest as I stayed perfectly still, listening. The noise stopped abruptly. Then after a long pause, I heard footsteps crunching away on the gravel driveway. The next morning, I found fresh tire tracks in the dirt road leading up to the cabin, but no car. The tracks looked like someone had turned around and left quickly. It was the first sign that whoever had been there might have come in a vehicle. I was torn between wanting to leave immediately and wanting to stay to figure out what was happening. The cabin was isolated, but not completely unreachable. I kept telling myself to stay calm and rational. There was probably a reasonable explanation. On the fourth day, as I was chopping wood outside, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was too far to make out details clearly, but it was definitely a person. I froze, gripping the axe handle tightly. The figure didn't move and didn't disappear. After a moment, I shouted, but they didn't respond. Then suddenly, they turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound seemed louder and more threatening. I checked every lock and even nailed some boards across the windows. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning, I decided I had to get out. I packed my bags quickly and stepped outside, only to find my car's tires slashed. Panic hit me hard. There was no phone signal, no way to call for help, and the nearest town was miles away. Whoever had been near the cabin had made sure I couldn't leave easily. I spent the day searching for any sign of people who might help or a place with a phone signal. The forest was dense and disorienting, with tangled undergrowth and twisted paths. The sun was low by the time I stumbled back to the cabin, exhausted and defeated. That night was the worst. The dragging noises returned, louder and closer. There were thumps against the cabin walls, heavy enough to shake the whole structure. I sat by the fire, clutching a heavy iron poker, ready to defend myself. The noises continued for hours, then stopped suddenly just before dawn. When morning came, I found a large, deep scratch along the door frame. It was long and jagged, like something had tried to pry the door open. I realized I couldn't stay there. The person or people outside weren't just trespassers or curious hikers. They were hunting me. I decided to make a run for it. I took what I could carry, food, water, and my jacket, and left the cabin quietly. I avoided the driveway and took a path through the woods, hoping to reach the main road and hitch a ride. The forest seemed endless, and my legs ached with every step. The sun was setting again, and I knew I had to find shelter or risk freezing overnight. I stumbled onto an old, overgrown logging road and followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. After an hour, I saw lights in the distance. Relief flooded me as I moved toward them, but then the sound of a vehicle engine started behind me. I froze, heart pounding. The headlights of a truck appeared through the trees, coming fast in my direction. I ducked behind a tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. The truck slowed, then stopped a few yards away. I held my breath, listening to the engine idling and the soft murmur of voices. The voices didn't matter. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to move, and fast. When the truck started moving again, I ran in the opposite direction, faster than I thought possible. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached a small ranger station at the edge of the forest. The ranger was surprised to see me so late, and even more surprised when I told him about the slashed tires and the strange presence at the cabin. He radioed for backup and gave me a ride into town. The police came the next day to investigate the cabin. They found evidence that someone had been living in the woods nearby for weeks, possibly watching. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a break from the noise and stress of the city. I had found a cabin for rent deep in the woods, a place far from any town or road, just nature and quiet. I packed my things carefully: clothes, food, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a book. No phone service, they said, but that was exactly why I wanted to go. I needed to be alone to clear my mind. The drive was long and winding. The last few miles were on a dirt road so rough and narrow that I had to go slow. The trees grew thick and close on either side, blocking most of the fading sunlight. The GPS stopped working halfway through, but I had a printed map and my instincts. The air smelled different, fresh but sharp with pine and earth. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was just dipping behind the hills. It was a small, wooden structure, weathered by years but still solid. A stone chimney rose on one side, and a thin column of smoke drifted up from it. A small porch wrapped around the front, with a couple of old chairs facing the forest. It looked peaceful, inviting even. I got out of the car and took a deep breath. The silence was almost total. No cars, no planes, no people. Just birds and the wind in the trees. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood and something faintly musty, maybe from disuse. The floor was creaky but clean, and there was a small kitchen area with a stove and some basic utensils. A table and chairs sat in the corner, and there was a narrow staircase leading up to a loft bedroom. I set my things down and decided to make a fire. The fireplace was big and solid, with a pile of dry wood stacked nearby. It took some effort to get it going, but soon flames flickered and cast a warm glow around the room. I sat back in one of the chairs, feeling the heat, and let my eyes wander around. The windows were small but let in some light from the outside. Trees surrounded the cabin so closely it felt like I was in a natural fortress. Night came fast, and with it, the darkness. I wasn't worried. I had been camping plenty of times before, but this was different. There was no sound except the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. No other cabins, no other people. Just me and the forest. I decided to get some rest. The loft had a small mattress and some blankets. I laid down, pulling the blankets tight, but sleep didn't come easily. The silence was too intense, almost like it was pressing against my ears. My mind started to wander, imagining all kinds of things. I told myself to stop, that it was just my imagination playing tricks. Around midnight, I woke up. Something was off. I could feel it in the air. The wind had stopped, and the usual night sounds were gone. No crickets, no owls, just silence again, but heavier now. I sat up and looked out the small window. The forest was black, the trees like tall shadows. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound coming from outside. It was faint, but it was there. It sounded like footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the cabin. Not running, not crashing through bushes, just careful steps on dry leaves or dirt. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. I stayed very still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, pausing sometimes, then continuing. My heart beat faster. I wanted to get my flashlight, but I was afraid to move. The cabin door was made of wood, old but strong. I told myself that was enough to keep me safe. The footsteps stopped suddenly, right outside the door. I could almost hear breathing, heavy and slow. Then nothing. The silence returned, but now it felt alive, as if the forest was watching me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. When the first light of dawn appeared through the trees, I finally felt some relief. The footsteps were gone. I spent the morning checking the cabin, making sure all the windows and doors were locked tight. Outside, I walked carefully around the cabin, looking for signs of whoever had been there. I found footprints in the dirt, human footprints, size about average, maybe a man. They circled the cabin several times and then disappeared into the woods. No other tracks, no animal prints, just those footsteps. That day, I tried to keep busy. I gathered firewood, cleaned up inside, and read my book. But my mind kept drifting back to the night before. Who had been outside my cabin? What were they doing? Was it a hunter or someone else? I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way I had never felt before in the woods. As evening came again, I prepared for another long night. I made sure the fire was strong and the doors were locked. I double-checked my flashlight and my phone, hoping maybe there would be a signal soon. There wasn't. Around 10 p.m., I heard something different. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a low noise, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. I froze and listened. It was slow and steady, scraping wood against wood, like someone was trying to pry open a window or a door. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought for protection and crept quietly to the main room. The fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside the window, I could hear the scraping continue, then stop, then start again. Suddenly, the back door handle rattled. Someone was trying to open it. My heart jumped into my throat. I took a deep breath and grabbed my flashlight. Shining it toward the door, I yelled as loud as I could, hoping to scare whoever it was away. There was a pause, then heavy footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I ran to the car and started it up. The engine roared to life, and I drove off down the dirt road, eyes on the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, the lights of the city welcoming and bright. I called the police and reported what had happened. They said they would send someone to check the cabin, but with such a remote location, it could take hours. I spent the night in a motel, too shaken to sleep properly. The feeling of being watched, of someone lurking just outside, stayed with me. The next day, I returned to the cabin with a police officer. They searched the area and found signs that someone had been living in the woods nearby. A makeshift campsite, some tools, and a few old cans. The footprints matched those found around my cabin. The officer explained that there had been reports of a man living off the grid in that forest for months. No one knew who he was or why he stayed there. Some hikers had seen him but kept their distance. The officer advised me not to return to the cabin alone. The man was considered dangerous, unpredictable. I agreed. I didn't want to take any chances. In the end, I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people. People who hide in the shadows, who watch silently, who don't belong in the world we live in but are still part of it. I never went back to that cabin. The forest lost its peacefulness for me. It became a place of danger and fear, a reminder that nature isn't always calm and safe, and that some things you can't control. That trip was supposed to be an escape, but it became one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I realized how vulnerable I was, how easy it is to be watched and stalked without knowing. I'm grateful I got out safely, but I'm also changed forever. Now, when I think of cabins in the woods, I don't think of quiet and peace. I think of waiting in the dark, hearing footsteps just outside, and knowing someone is out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. That feeling doesn't go away. It stays with you, like a shadow you can't shake. The trip started out like any other solo cabin getaway I had taken over the years. I found peace in the quiet of the woods, away from the noise of the city and the constant pull of technology. The cabin was a small, wooden structure nestled deep in a remote part of the forest. I'd driven for hours along narrow dirt roads and through thick groves of trees until the forest swallowed me whole. The last stretch was a rough track barely wide enough for my old SUV, flanked by towering pines and thick underbrush that brushed the sides of the vehicle like a curtain closing behind me. The cabin itself was isolated, far from any other houses or signs of life. It was the kind of place where you could hear every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind through the branches, and every crunch of leaves underfoot. It had no electricity or running water, just a small wood stove, a well, and enough basic furniture to sleep and sit comfortably. I packed enough supplies for a week, including food that didn't need refrigeration, water jugs, batteries, and some books. The first day was calm. I spent it chopping firewood, setting up the stove, and exploring the immediate area. The air smelled crisp and clean. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the distant rustle of small animals. I felt the usual thrill of isolation that I sought, a deep breathing space where the world seemed to stop. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's wooden walls and shaking the branches outside. I sat by the stove, its orange flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The silence outside was almost complete, except for the occasional snap of a twig or the far-off call of an owl. It was peaceful and a little unnerving at the same time, the kind of silence that makes you notice your own heartbeat. The second day, I decided to hike farther into the woods, deeper than I usually went. I wanted to find a creek I'd heard about from a ranger the last time I was there. The forest grew denser as I walked, the trees taller and the undergrowth thicker. The path was faint, sometimes disappearing altogether beneath fallen leaves and branches. I kept my map and compass close, making sure not to lose my way. After several hours, I finally heard the gentle babble of water and found the creek. It was clear and cold, winding through moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. I sat by the bank, filling my water bottle and resting my feet in the chilly stream. The forest around me felt different here, quieter, stiller. There was a heaviness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. I didn't stay long. I turned back before the sun dipped too low, retracing my steps carefully. On the way back, the forest seemed less welcoming. The shadows lengthened, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves put me on edge. I made it to the cabin just as dusk settled. That night, the wind returned stronger than before. The cabin creaked and groaned with the gusts, and the trees outside seemed to lean closer. I tried to shake off a growing feeling of unease. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure before sitting by the fire again. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time, a faint noise outside. It was subtle, like something brushing against the cabin, a soft scraping or dragging sound. I froze, listening hard, but the noise stopped quickly. I thought maybe it was just the wind or a branch rubbing against the siding. I tried to fall asleep, but the sound returned a few times, always soft and brief. Each time, my heart jumped and my skin prickled. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest at night. The third day dawned cold and gray, with heavy clouds pressing down on the trees. I stayed inside most of the day, reading and keeping the fire going. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Late in the afternoon, I stepped outside to collect firewood. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just silence. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. I noticed that the footprints in the dirt around the cabin weren't just mine. There were others, faint but definite. Some were large, some small, all coming and going in no clear pattern. They didn't look like animal tracks. My heart pounded. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. The forest looked empty, but those tracks told a different story. I gathered my wood quickly and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, the noises outside grew louder and closer. The scraping sounds returned, along with soft thuds and something that sounded like something heavy being dragged. I stayed near the stove, clutching an old hunting knife I'd brought just in case. I watched the windows, the darkness outside thick and impenetrable. At one point, I caught a movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. It was quick, barely visible, but enough to send a cold wave through me. The wind died down suddenly, leaving the night unnervingly still. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard footsteps outside, circling the cabin. The noises never lasted long, but they were relentless. I wondered if I was imagining it, letting my mind play tricks on me in the isolation. But the tracks outside told me otherwise. On the fourth day, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed some supplies and planned to leave by noon. The sky was clear but gray, the sun a pale circle behind thick clouds. The forest felt oppressive now, the trees towering like silent watchers. I started my SUV and headed down the dirt track, but it wasn't long before I hit a problem. About a mile down the road, a fallen tree blocked the path. It looked recent, the branches were still fresh and green. I tried to push the tree, but it was too heavy. I grabbed my axe and started chopping at the limbs, but it took time. While I worked, I noticed something else, more tracks around the tree and in the dirt road beyond. These were bigger, deeper, and they circled the tree as if something had been pacing or waiting. I couldn't see what, but I felt it watching me. The air grew colder, and the sky darkened as clouds gathered. I kept chopping, wanting to clear the road and get away. Then I heard it, a low growl, coming from the forest to my left. It wasn't an animal I knew. It was deep and guttural, filled with menace. I stopped, gripping the axe tightly. The growl came again, closer this time. My heart raced as I scanned the trees. There, between the trunks, I saw a figure. It was large, hunched, and moving slowly but deliberately toward me. It wasn't an animal. It looked human but wrong somehow, too big, too quick in its movements. I dropped the axe and jumped into the SUV, slamming the door shut and locking it. I fumbled with the keys and finally got the engine to roar to life. The figure stopped at the edge of the road, watching me, before retreating slowly back into the trees. I didn't look back. I drove fast, the tires throwing up dirt and gravel, the engine roaring against the silence of the forest. The tracks, the noises, the figure. I knew I wasn't alone out there. Something had been stalking the cabin, watching me, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the sun was setting, painting the sky blood red. I pulled over, took a deep breath, and called for help. The ranger station confirmed no one else had been near the cabin or that area for days. No one had reported any strange sightings, no missing persons, nothing. But I knew the truth. I had been followed, trapped in a place where something dangerous lurked just beyond the trees. The forest that had once felt peaceful had revealed a darker side, a wildness that didn't welcome visitors. I haven't gone back since. The cabin still stands there, silent and empty. I can't say what exactly I saw or heard, but I know it was real. Sometimes I think about that shadow, the footprints, the growl in the night, and I shudder. Some places in the woods aren't meant for us. Some quiet hides danger beneath it, and some isolation brings a visitor you can't see coming. I learned that the hard way. The forest kept its secrets, and I was lucky enough to leave with mine intact. The day I decided to go to the cabin alone started out like any other normal Saturday. I had been craving some time away from the city, the noise, the crowds, and the constant buzz of traffic and people. I wanted silence, or at least as much silence as I could get. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from my apartment, tucked away in a remote part of the woods. I had rented it for the weekend, hoping to escape and reset my mind. I packed carefully, not wanting to forget anything important. I took my backpack, a tent just in case, some food, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. My phone was fully charged, but I knew the signal there would be weak at best. I also packed some water and a small camping stove to boil water if needed. I wanted to be prepared but not overburdened. The drive was long but peaceful. The road turned from asphalt to gravel as I got closer, and the trees thickened on both sides. The sun was setting by the time I pulled off the main gravel road and onto the dirt path that led directly to the cabin. I could see it in the fading light, a small, weathered wooden structure with a porch that creaked under the slightest pressure. When I stepped out of the car, the air was different, cooler and cleaner. The forest smelled of pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath and felt the tension in my shoulders ease a little. This was exactly what I needed. I grabbed my backpack and walked to the front door. The cabin's wooden steps groaned beneath me as I climbed up to the porch. I pushed the door open, and the smell of old wood and faint mildew hit me immediately. The place hadn't been used for a while, I guessed. Dust floated in the weak beams of my flashlight as I looked around. The cabin was small, with a single room that combined living and sleeping areas, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom in the back. I set my backpack down and started unpacking. I arranged the food on the small table, set up the camping stove, and laid out my sleeping bag on the bed. The cabin had electricity, but the lights were flickering and unreliable. I tested the lights a few times before deciding it was better to use the flashlight. The windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the fading daylight. I stepped outside again to stretch my legs. The forest was almost dark now, shadows thick and deep among the trees. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I could hear the faint hum of insects settling down for the night. I made a mental note to keep the doors locked. Something about being alone in the woods, even a well-built cabin, made me a bit uneasy. Back inside, I cooked some soup on the stove and ate slowly. The silence in the cabin was heavy. It wasn't peaceful so much as it was thick and expectant, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I kept telling myself that I was being silly. The forest was safe. People lived here year-round. But that uneasy feeling stayed with me. After eating, I decided to explore around the cabin a bit. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out again. The dirt path stretched out behind the cabin, leading deeper into the woods. I followed it for a short while, just long enough to feel the isolation. The trees stood close and tall on either side, and the dirt path was soft underfoot. I could hear my breathing, loud in the quiet. I didn't go far, just a few hundred feet before I turned back. The sun was gone now, and the moon barely peeked through the thick canopy of leaves. I got back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. The feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind, but I shook it off. Inside, I settled in for the night. I checked my phone one last time, no signal, just a blinking bar that didn't connect. I turned on the flashlight and lay on the bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. The house was creaking now, the old wood shifting as the temperature dropped. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up, rustling the leaves and sending little branches tapping against the windows. I felt myself drifting off when suddenly, a loud, sharp noise shattered the silence. It was a bang, like something heavy hitting the cabin's side. I sat up, heart racing, flashlight in hand. I listened, but the only sounds were the wind and the distant cry of an animal. I told myself it was probably a branch blown loose by the wind, but my nerves were frayed. I got up and checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked tight. I tried to settle back down, but the sound repeated. Another bang, louder this time, then a scraping noise, like something dragging along the side of the cabin. I was too scared to look outside, but I forced myself up. With the flashlight, I shone it on the window nearest the noise. The beam revealed nothing but shadows and shaking tree branches. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, slow steps. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone outside could hear it. The steps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath. Then, after what felt like minutes, they moved away, slow and heavy down the porch steps and into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. The wind died down, but the forest stayed alive with noises. Small animals scurrying, leaves crunching, twigs snapping. I kept thinking about what I'd heard and seen. Maybe someone was out there, but why? The cabin was so isolated, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Morning finally came, pale and gray. I was exhausted but relieved to see the light. I looked out the window and saw the marks on the cabin side where something had scraped the wood. There were footprints in the dirt around the porch, large and heavy, but too deep to be just an animal. I took pictures with my phone and decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't going to wait around to find out who or what had been there last night. As I loaded my things into the car, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt leading from the road toward the cabin. They were too deep and deliberate to be anything but human. I followed them a short way but lost the trail where the ground was softer. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The road back to the highway felt longer and darker than before. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, and I didn't stop until I reached a small town and a gas station where I felt safe enough to rest. The whole experience left me shaken. When I got home, I reported what happened to the local sheriff's office. They told me that the area was sometimes used by hunters or others who like to sneak into cabins, sometimes for illegal things like poaching or squatting. They said they'd send a patrol by the cabin, but that nothing serious had been reported there before. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The memory of the heavy footsteps and the scraping noises stayed with me. I realized that the woods were not just peaceful and quiet. They could be dangerous and lonely, especially when someone else was out there who didn't want to be found. I never went back to that cabin. The idea of being alone in a place like that, with no help nearby, and someone else out there who might be watching, it was too much. I learned that sometimes the scariest things don't come from ghosts or stories. They come from real people, real danger, and the wild unknown. That weekend in the cabin was a lesson in how quickly calm can turn to fear. I had gone looking for peace but found something far more unsettling. The reminder that we are never truly alone in the wild, and sometimes the shadows we see aren't just tricks of the light. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city and the relentless buzz of everyday life. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any neighbors or main roads, the kind of place where your phone barely worked and the only real sounds came from the trees and the wildlife. It was exactly what I wanted. A chance to disconnect, to be alone, and maybe just clear my head. The drive there was long, winding through narrow forest roads lined with tall pine and birch trees. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt driveway that led to the cabin. The place looked sturdy enough from the outside. A small wooden building with a steep roof, dark green trim around the windows, and a porch that wrapped halfway around one side. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, though I knew no one was there yet. I'd arranged to have the place cleaned and prepped, but it was my first time staying there alone. The keys were in a lockbox, and I didn't expect any surprises. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a little table with mismatched chairs, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, and a single bedroom off to the side. The floor creaked slightly underfoot, the wood worn smooth from years of use. I unpacked slowly, laying out my things and stacking firewood beside the stove. The air smelled faintly of pine and something else, something musty that reminded me this place hadn't been used in a while. I lit a fire in the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the room, and sat down with a book to relax. Night came quickly in the forest. Outside, the sounds changed. The birds stopped chirping, replaced by the rustling of small animals in the underbrush and the occasional distant call of an owl. The sky was clear, the stars bright above the black silhouette of the trees. It was peaceful but also strangely isolating, the kind of quiet that presses down on you, making you aware of every small noise inside the cabin. The drip of condensation from the roof, the soft creak of the wood settling, the scratch of something moving just outside the window. At first, I thought it was just animals, deer, maybe raccoons or squirrels. I'd read that the forest was full of life, even at night, and I told myself not to worry. I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, making sure the fire was burning steady before climbing into bed. The bed was firm and creaked when I moved, the blankets rough but warm. I wasn't used to camping or cabins, but I liked the simplicity. I didn't sleep well. The sounds outside didn't stop, and I found myself listening, straining to catch every little noise. Every now and then, there was a louder rustle, like branches scraping against the cabin walls or footsteps moving through the brush. I told myself it was nothing. The forest was full of animals, and I was safe inside. In the morning, the sun filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. I got up early, eager to get outside and explore. The cabin sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest in every direction. I walked along the dirt path that led into the trees, careful to step on dry leaves and avoid the thick undergrowth. The forest was quiet in the daylight, the air fresh and cool. I saw birds flitting between branches, a squirrel darting up a tree, and small wildflowers growing along the path. As I walked, I noticed some things that made me pause. There were footprints in the dirt, not animal tracks, but human prints. They were fresh, pressed clearly into the soil, leading deeper into the woods and then disappearing. That made my stomach tighten. I hadn't expected anyone else in these parts. The cabin was supposed to be remote, and I hadn't seen any other cars on the way in. I thought about calling someone, but my phone barely had signal here, and I didn't want to overreact. Maybe hunters or hikers had passed through earlier. Still, the feeling of being watched crept in. I kept my eyes open and quickened my pace back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed slowly. I chopped wood for the stove, cleaned the cabin, and tried to keep busy with my book and a few small chores. The forest was alive all around me, and I found myself constantly checking the windows, feeling the weight of the silence outside. The footprints lingered in my mind, an unwelcome reminder that I wasn't as alone as I'd hoped. As night fell again, the unease grew. The forest sounds returned, louder and sharper. I heard snapping twigs, rustling leaves, and something heavier moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I kept the fire going, stacking logs and lighting candles, trying to keep the darkness at bay. I checked the locks on the doors and windows twice, making sure everything was secure. At some point during the night, I was woken by a noise, a sharp, deliberate tap on the window. My heart stopped. I stayed frozen for a moment, staring at the glass, half expecting to see something or someone. But the window was dark and empty. I told myself it was probably a branch knocking in the wind, but the sound had been too clear, too controlled. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found more signs that someone had been near the cabin. A few of the firewood logs I'd stacked were scattered on the ground, and the lockbox where the keys were kept was open, the keys gone. I felt a surge of panic. Someone had been inside or very close. I checked every door and window again. Nothing was broken, but the place felt violated. I packed up my things quickly, planning to leave immediately, but then I noticed something else. On the porch, half hidden under a pile of leaves, was a small, crudely carved wooden figure. It looked like a rough human shape, maybe a little over a foot tall, with scratch marks on its surface. I hadn't brought it, and it wasn't there when I arrived. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. There was no note or message with it, but the figure gave me a deep sense of unease. Whoever had been here wanted me to find it, but I didn't know why. I started the walk back to my car, clutching the figure tightly. The forest felt colder, heavier somehow, as if it was watching me leave. The footprints from before had multiplied, now circling around the cabin and leading back into the woods in every direction. It was clear I wasn't the only one in this place, and whoever else was out there didn't want me here. On the drive home, I kept glancing at the figure beside me, feeling a knot in my stomach. I didn't tell anyone about the trip at first, but after a few days, I mentioned the footprints and the strange wooden figure to a close friend who knows about the area. She told me stories of local trespassers, sometimes homeless people or hunters who used the woods to hide or camp illegally. They could be dangerous if surprised or scared. That made sense. The footprints weren't supernatural or ghostly. They were real people, but that didn't make me feel any better. I realized I had been lucky. Lucky the trespassers hadn't tried to confront me. Lucky they left without damaging the cabin or hurting me. I went back a few weeks later with someone else to check the cabin and clean up. The place felt different then, quieter and less threatening. The footprints were gone, and the wooden figure had disappeared. I made sure to change the locks and set up some security cameras outside. In the end, the trip wasn't about ghosts or legends or anything unexplainable. It was about being alone in a place where other people might be hiding, watching, waiting, and not knowing what they would do if they found you. It was about how the silence of the forest can feel like a trap, and how real danger sometimes comes not from shadows, but from other human beings. I still think about that weekend often. It taught me something important about being careful, about respect for the unknown, and about how alone you really are when you step away from the safety of civilization. The cabin stands empty now, waiting for the next visitor, and I'm glad I was able to leave it behind, with my life and my peace intact. It was the kind of trip I thought I'd remember forever, though at the time I never could have guessed how much it would change the way I look at being alone. I rented the cabin on a whim, just a small wooden place deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. No internet, no phone signal, nothing but silence and the trees. I was craving a break from everything: work, noise, people. So I packed some basic supplies and drove out there. The road to the cabin was rough, just a narrow dirt path winding through thick forest. The trees pressed in tight on both sides, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air smelled damp, heavy with pine and moss. I kept thinking about how quiet it was, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's watching you. When I finally spotted the cabin, it looked like it belonged to a different time. Weathered wood, faded paint, a little porch with a creaky railing. No car tracks near it, no sign anyone had been there in a while. The silence wrapped around the place like a blanket. I pulled my stuff inside. The cabin was small but sturdy. A single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen corner, and a cot pushed against the wall. The windows were grimy but let in enough light to see the dust floating in the air. I set down my backpack and opened the windows to let fresh air in. The stillness outside was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. I made a small fire in the stove, just enough to warm the room. The crackling of the fire was comforting, a tiny noise in the vast quiet. The first night passed without much incident. I was tired from the drive and the hike from the last spot where the car could go, so I slept hard. But as the sun rose the next morning, I started noticing small things that unsettled me. Tracks around the cabin. Some looked like animal prints, but there were others that didn't match anything I recognized. They were too big, and some had a strange shape, almost like a boot, but not quite. I chalked it up to weird shadows or a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched was growing heavier. That day, I decided to explore the area a bit. The forest stretched for miles, thick with trees and underbrush. The ground was uneven, covered with leaves and fallen branches. I walked for hours, trying to follow a faint path I found, but it quickly faded. The deeper I went, the darker the woods became. The canopy above blocked most sunlight, and the air grew cooler and damper. I kept hearing noises, a branch breaking here, a low rustle there. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing but empty forest. The feeling of being followed crept in again, slow and steady. When I got back to the cabin just before sunset, I noticed something else. The firewood I had stacked neatly outside was scattered, some pieces broken in half. I hadn't heard any animals around that could do that, and the wind was still that day. I started double-checking the locks on the windows and doors. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was secure. Still, the thought that someone or something might have been near when I was gone made my skin crawl. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little noise, the wind tapping on the roof, a branch scraping the side of the cabin, felt magnified. I kept waking up, listening, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on the dry leaves outside. I sat up and stared into the darkness beyond the window. Nothing moved. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, things got worse. The footprints were clearer now, scattered all around the cabin. Some were close enough to be made by someone standing right next to the walls. But when I looked for signs of people, The usual garbage, cigarette butts, discarded food. There was none. No trash, no footprints leading far away, just these strange marks around the cabin. I felt trapped, like the forest itself was closing in. I tried to focus on practical things. I gathered more firewood, cleaned the inside, checked my supplies. I started making sure I had extra water and food packed just in case. The air was thick with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for days. That afternoon, I went down to a small creek I'd spotted a little way from the cabin. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I knelt down and filled my bottle, trying to calm my nerves. As I looked around, I noticed some things I hadn't before. Broken branches, patches of crushed grass, a few tufts of hair caught on a bush. It looked like something big had been moving through here recently. I didn't want to think about what, but I couldn't deny it. Back at the cabin, I made sure everything was locked tight before nightfall. I placed some of the firewood by the windows and doors, some kind of barrier, I guess, even if it didn't make much sense. I sat near the stove with a knife I'd brought, the metal cold in my hand. The fire sputtered and popped. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows. The forest was alive with sounds I didn't recognize, and I couldn't tell if it was animals or something else. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping or dragging. I froze, listening. It was coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. I slipped out of bed quietly and moved toward the window. The fire had died down, and the room was dark except for a sliver of moonlight through the cracks in the walls. Peered outside, heart pounding. I could just make out shapes moving in the shadows, something large, maybe two figures. They weren't animals. The way they moved was deliberate, slow, like they were searching for something. I swallowed hard and moved back from the window. My first thought was to call for help, but the phone had no signal. I was completely cut off. I grabbed my backpack and started packing quickly, deciding to leave immediately. I knew I couldn't stay there with whatever was outside. As I stuffed things in, the sounds got louder. Heavy footsteps around the cabin, something scraping the wood, like nails or claws. My breath came fast, and my hands shook. By the time I was ready to leave, the door handle was being tested, slow, careful movements as if someone was trying to get in without making noise. I took a deep breath, grabbed the flashlight, and slipped out the back door. The cold night air hit me like a wall. I ran without looking back, the beam of my flashlight bobbing wildly as I pushed through the underbrush. The sounds followed me, faint but persistent. The path to my car was dark and uneven. I stumbled several times, my heart in my throat. I didn't stop until I saw the headlights of my car through the trees. When I reached it, I slammed the door shut and locked it immediately. I started the engine, my hands trembling so badly I could barely steer. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The forest was still, but I could swear something was watching from the edge of the trees, just waiting. I didn't stop until I reached a town several miles away, where the lights and people finally felt safe. I never went back to that cabin. The police didn't find anything when I reported it, and locals told me the area was known for poachers and people who lived off the grid. What I encountered, I'll never know for sure, but I do know one thing. Being alone out there, in the middle of nowhere, makes you vulnerable in ways you never imagine. The silence isn't peaceful, it's a warning. And sometimes what's watching you doesn't have to be a ghost or monster to be terrifying. It's just someone or something that wants to make sure you don't leave. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A break from the noise of the city, from the endless emails, the constant buzz of people demanding things I didn't really want to give. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, far away from any town or even a proper road. The idea was simple. Take a few days alone, clear my head, breathe fresh air, and maybe do some hiking. Nothing complicated. No one would bother me there. At least that's what I thought. The drive was long. My car rattled on dirt roads and gravel paths, the trees closing in on both sides like a green tunnel. I kept checking the GPS, but after a while, the signal faded completely, and the path was just a rough trail through the forest. I stopped twice to check maps and my phone, but the battery was already low, and I didn't want to risk running out of power before I even got there. I had brought a physical map and a compass just in case, though I hoped I wouldn't have to use them. Finally, after several turns and a steep climb up a rocky hill, I saw it, the cabin. It was smaller than I imagined, made of dark wood that had faded with age, with a stone chimney on one side and a small porch with a wooden bench. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady, which meant someone had been here recently or was still nearby. The area around the cabin was clear, with a small fire pit and scattered logs for seating. I parked the car near a large oak tree and grabbed my backpack. The first thing I did was check the inside of the cabin. It was simple, just one room with a small kitchen area, a table, a wood stove, and a bed pushed into a corner. The place smelled faintly of old wood and smoke. There was no electricity, but I had brought a few candles and a small camping lantern with extra batteries. The cabin was clean but showed signs of wear. Scratches on the floor, a cracked window, and a door that didn't close quite right. I unpacked my things, laid out some food, and started a fire in the stove. The warmth spread quickly, filling the room with a soft glow and a comforting heat. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and birds called in the distance. The peaceful silence felt like a balm after months of stress. The first night passed quietly. I slept with the window cracked open, listening to the sounds of the forest. The occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the distant snap of a twig. Nothing strange, just nature doing its thing. The next morning I woke early. The sky was still gray from the dawn, and a light mist hovered over the clearing. I decided to explore the area around the cabin before the sun got too high. I put on my boots, grabbed my backpack with water and snacks, and headed down a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The forest was dense, with tall pines and thick underbrush. The smell of pine needles and damp earth was sharp in the cool air. I walked carefully, enjoying the peace but also paying attention. I wasn't completely naive about the dangers. Wild animals, uneven ground, getting lost. But I felt prepared. I kept my compass out, marking my way as I went. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something odd. On a tree near the path, someone had carved a symbol. It looked like a circle with lines crossing through it. Not something I recognized, but it was definitely deliberate. I touched the bark, running my fingers over the fresh cuts. The marks were new, maybe a day or two old. I paused and looked around, half expecting to see someone watching, but there was no one, just the trees and the quiet. I shrugged it off and kept going. As I walked further, the trail became less clear. Some branches were broken, and I had to push through bushes that grabbed at my jacket. The forest seemed thicker here, darker, even though the sun was out. Shadows stretched between the trunks like fingers. I tried to stay on the path, but the markings were faint. After a while, I found another symbol carved into a rock beside the trail, the same one as before. That was when a cold feeling ran down my spine. Who had been here recently? Why were these marks left in the forest? I decided not to go further. I took out my phone to take a picture of the carvings, but no signal again. The battery was low, so I put it away and started back toward the cabin. The walk back was slower. I kept glancing over my shoulder, the feeling of being watched growing heavier. When I finally saw the clearing where the cabin sat, I let out a small breath of relief. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and checked the windows. Everything seemed normal. I made some lunch, eating quietly, and tried to push the uneasy feeling aside. That afternoon, I tried to focus on relaxing. I read a book, sat on the porch watching the forest, and even tried to start a small fire outside. The sun was warm, and the breeze was gentle. But still, the feeling of eyes on me wouldn't go away. As evening fell, I lit more candles inside. The cabin looked cozy in the flickering light, but I kept double-checking the locks. The wind picked up, making the trees groan and the old cabin creak. Every sound felt sharper, louder in the silence. At one point, I heard a noise outside, a rustling near the edge of the clearing. I stood still, listening. The noise stopped, then a faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows moving with the wind. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but I didn't like it. I went back inside, locked the door again, and stayed near the wood stove where the fire crackled and the warmth felt safe. That night was harder to sleep. Every little noise made me jump. The wind howled outside, and the cabin seemed to breathe with it. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I could hear the gravel crunching, leaves shifting. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, then silence. I waited for what felt like an hour before the footsteps finally faded away. When morning came, I was exhausted but relieved it was over. I opened the door carefully and looked around the clearing. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, boots size large. They circled the cabin, stopping by the door. I couldn't tell who had been there. There was no way to know. I thought about calling the police, but without signal and being so far from town, it felt useless. Besides, there was no sign anyone was still around. Whoever it was had left. I packed my things slowly that day, making sure to double-check everything. I didn't want to stay another night. As I was loading my car, I found more carvings on a tree near the road. The same symbol, but this time, with an arrow pointing away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. I looked down the path and saw tire tracks, not just from my car, but older, deeper tracks from a larger vehicle. Someone else had been using these roads recently, and they hadn't wanted me to come. I got in the car and started driving back the way I came. The forest seemed to watch me leave, the trees silent and still. Halfway down the trail, I heard a sound behind me, a low engine rumble. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights far behind, following. The road was narrow and winding, but the vehicle was keeping pace. My heart pounded. I pushed the gas, but the dirt road was rough, and my car bounced over rocks and roots. The headlights stayed close. After several minutes, the car behind made a sudden turn onto a side trail and disappeared. I kept driving until I reached a paved road, then stopped at a gas station to call someone. I told a friend everything, and they suggested I go to the nearest town to report it. The police came out the next day, searched the area around the cabin, and found the carvings. They said it looked like some kind of marking used by a group of hunters or people marking territory, but no one was currently living there. The footprints near the cabin matched no known suspects. I never went back. I still wonder who was watching me those nights, why they followed me, and what they wanted. The forest is quiet now when I remember it, but the memory of those eyes in the dark, the footsteps outside the door, and those strange symbols carved into the trees stays with me. I learned that some places in the woods aren't just empty spaces. They are claimed, watched, and controlled by people you never see until it's too late. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth when I pulled up to the cabin. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low behind the thick trees that surrounded the small clearing. I'd been driving for hours, following narrow, winding dirt roads that cut through dense forest. The GPS stopped working a few miles back, and after that, it was just me and the map printed out on my phone. The cabin looked old but solid. It was a rough wooden structure, maybe built 50 or 60 years ago. The paint was peeling in places, and some of the boards on the porch creaked under my boots as I stepped out. I'd rented this place for the weekend to get away from the noise and stress of the city. No phone signal, no internet, just the silence of the woods and the promise of a few quiet days. Inside, the cabin was cold and smelled faintly of mold and dust. The windows were grimy, but I could see the thick forest all around. A stone fireplace sat against one wall, its hearth blackened with old ashes. The furniture was sparse and worn, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. There was an old cast iron stove in the kitchen, a pile of firewood stacked by the door, and a rusty metal bucket in the corner. I unpacked a few things, setting my backpack down by the door, and went outside to gather some firewood. The woods were quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. The ground was covered with fallen needles and dead branches, and the trees stood tall and thick, blocking most of the sky. As the sun dipped lower, I built a fire in the fireplace and sat near it, feeling the warmth against the chill that had settled in the cabin. The flames crackled and popped, and the orange light flickered against the rough wooden walls. Outside, the forest grew darker and the shadows longer. I didn't bring a lot with me, just some basic food, a flashlight, a knife, and my sleeping bag. I wanted to keep things simple, to disconnect. The silence was heavy but peaceful. I was alone and I liked that. Later, after dinner, I decided to explore the area a little. There was a small path behind the cabin that led into the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and followed it. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and low branches. The path was narrow and uneven, covered with leaves and pine needles. After a few minutes, I heard a sound that made me stop. It was faint at first, almost like a distant knocking or tapping. I listened closely, and it seemed to come from deeper in the woods. I shone the flashlight in that direction, but all I could see were trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a woodpecker or a branch knocking against a tree. Still, the sound made my skin crawl, and I hurried back to the cabin. Inside, I locked the door and closed the curtains. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room felt colder than before. I sat in a chair close to the fireplace, trying to calm my nerves. The knocking sound kept replaying in my mind. Around midnight, I was about to go to bed when I heard something at the door. A faint scratching, like nails or claws scraping against the wood. My heart jumped. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the door. There was nothing there. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening for any sounds. The forest outside was silent except for the occasional rustle. I told myself I was just tired and that it was probably an animal or the wind. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside. The sun was just rising, casting golden light through the trees. I went down to a small stream I'd seen on the map. The water was cold and clear. I filled my water bottle and sat on a rock, trying to shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. On the way back, I noticed footprints in the soft mud by the stream. They were large and deep like boots, but they didn't match mine. The prints headed toward the cabin. I felt a chill run down my spine. Back at the cabin, I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked tight, but the footprints didn't seem to come from the cabin itself. Whoever or whatever made them hadn't gone inside. I tried to focus on the day, chopping firewood, fixing a broken chair, and making a simple lunch. The forest felt peaceful in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I heard the knocking and scratching again, louder this time. It wasn't just the door anymore. It was coming from all around the cabin. The wooden walls seemed to tremble with the noise. I held the flashlight tightly, my hands shaking. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the window. I jumped back and swung the flashlight toward the glass. Outside, in the darkness, I could just make out a figure moving between the trees. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my backpack, threw some food and water inside, and ran out the back door into the woods. The cold air hit my face, and I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. I ran without looking back, stumbling over roots and rocks. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in on all sides. I had no idea where I was going, just away from the cabin and the figure chasing me. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a dirt road. I was exhausted and scared. I saw a car parked on the side of the road. I ran to it, banging on the door until someone inside unlocked it. I explained quickly, trying not to sound crazy. They called the police, and after some searching, they found the cabin. No one else was there. The footprints around the cabin looked fresh, but no signs of who had made them. The officers told me the area had a history of break-ins and some dangerous people hiding in the woods. I never went back to the cabin. I still can't explain exactly what I saw or heard that night, but I know I was lucky to get out. Now, whenever I think about that weekend, the silence of the forest feels different, like it's holding a secret. I've learned that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see, just feel watching you from the dark.